Elden Ring is full of things that were never meant to be found, and this video is going to walk through all of them. From glitches that break the game's reality, to audio events that only trigger under the strangest conditions, to lore fragments that suggest the world is far more unstable than it looks. I put this video together because I kept running into moments in Elden Ring where the game seemed to be doing something it wasn't supposed to. Not just bugs, not just clipping through a flaw, I mean moments where the game's own logic appeared to contradict itself, where something would happen that had no obvious explanation, and when I started pulling on those threads, I found a lot more underneath. When I was assembling this, I made a deliberate choice to focus on anomalies that have some kind of connection to the lore, or that suggest something about how the game was built and changed during development. I left out a lot of pure speedrunning tech and kept the stuff that feels like it means something, even if what it means isn't entirely clear. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So let's get into it. The first thing worth establishing is what we actually mean by anomaly in this context. Elden Ring is a massive game built on a decade of From Software engine architecture, and the sheer scale of the lands between means there are systems layered on top of systems in ways that even the developers probably didn't fully anticipate. An anomaly, for the purposes of this video, is anything that sits outside the expected behavior of the game. That includes visual glitches, audio events that appear where they shouldn't, enemy behaviors that don't match their scripted patterns, environmental details that seem to reference things that were cut or changed, and lore-adjacent weirdness where the game seems to be saying something it never quite finishes saying. We're going to spend a lot of time on that last category, because that's the one that tends to stick with people. When a game has as much carefully layered lore as Elden Ring does, the gaps and contradictions become interesting in a way they wouldn't be in a lesser game. George R.R. Martin wrote the world's history, and From Software built the present-day ruins of that history. And that gap between what was written and what was built is where a lot of the most interesting anomalies live. Let's start with something that a lot of players have experienced without necessarily knowing what it was. The phantom footsteps of Stormveil Castle if you've spent any real time in Stormveil Castle, especially if you were exploring at a slower pace and not just trying to get to Godric as fast as possible. There's a reasonable chance you heard something that you couldn't immediately explain. Stormveil is loud, generally speaking. There's wind through the broken walls, there are the sounds of the grafted soldiers shuffling around, birds on the ramparts, the general ambient noise of a crumbling castle. But some players have reported hearing footsteps that don't correspond to any enemy on screen. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, the kind that sound like something in armour. The first instinct is usually to assume there's an enemy nearby that you haven't spotted yet. The castle has a lot of hidden alcoves and rooms off the main path, but some players, after extensively clearing areas and then backtracking, have continued to hear these footsteps even in rooms with no living enemies. The sound appears to come from above, or from behind a wall, but the castle's geometry doesn't always match what you hear. One possible reading of this is that it's simply a bug. Stormveil Castle reuses a lot of audio triggers, and it's plausible that some footstep sounds are set to fire on timers or proximity triggers that aren't perfectly matched to enemy positions, especially in an area as geometrically complicated as that castle. The level design involves multiple vertical layers, and audio in games often doesn't respect walls and floors the way we expect it to. But there's a more interesting interpretation, and it connects to something in the lore. Stormveil was not always Godric's castle. It has a much older history, and the castle itself sits in a region that was, before the Shattering, one of the more politically significant parts of Limgrave. The grafted soldiers that fill the castle now are Godric's creation, but the castle existed long before Godric arrived. There are traces of an older garrison throughout the architecture, and some of the item descriptions in Stormveil reference soldiers who served a different master entirely. Soldiers who died defending the castle from enemies that predate the current conflict. The game doesn't name these older soldiers in any specific way that I can find, but their presence is implied throughout the castle's design, and the footsteps, if they are more than just a glitch, suggest something that the lore supports, which is that places in the lands between retain impressions of violence and occupation long after the people involved are gone. This isn't a concept Elden Ring invented. From Software has been building worlds where the past is physically present since the original Dark Souls, but in Elden Ring, this idea is more explicitly supported by the game's mechanics than it ever was before. The grace system and temporal residue, the sites of grace, are one of the most interesting pieces of world-building in Elden Ring, and I think they're underappreciated precisely because they function so smoothly as a game mechanic. They feel like a design choice, which they are, but they're also described in world as something specific and weird. Grace is described throughout the game as a kind of divine guidance, a remnant of the Erdtree's influence that lingers in certain places. When you rest at a site of grace, you're essentially dipping into a reservoir of stored time and accumulated significance. The anomaly here is subtle. In certain locations across the lands between, sites of grace exist in places that don't obviously connect to any significant event. There's a site of grace in a pit, in a cave with nothing in it, on a stretch of road with no obvious landmark nearby. The game explains sites of grace as marking places of significance, but the significance isn't always apparent. Some players have mapped these and found patterns that suggest the sites of grace are marking locations that were significant in a version of the world that no longer exists. The underground rivers, for instance, have sites of grace placed in ways that only make sense if you understand that the underground was once on the surface, which the lore confirms. The surface of the lands between is built on top of an older world that was buried, and the grace seems to remember that older geography. One specific example worth noting is in the Siofra Riverwell area. If you trace the sites of grace in Siofra and compare them to the surface geography above, there's a rough correspondence that suggests the underground space was once a surface location, and the grace markers are treating it as if the old surface geography is still relevant. The grace remembers something the landscape has forgotten. This isn't technically a glitch, it's a design detail, but it behaves like an anomaly because it creates moments of dissonance where the game's guidance system seems to be pointing you towards something that isn't visible, something that has been buried or replaced. The Wandering Noble problem. Let's talk about the Wandering Nobles for a minute, because they're one of the strangest enemies in the game, and I don't think they get enough attention from a lore perspective. The Wandering Nobles are the robed figures you encounter throughout the early game, clustered around bonfires and campsites, often seemingly doing nothing. They're weak, passive in most cases, and they don't drop anything particularly interesting. They're treated by most players as background noise, the human equivalent of a rat enemy, just something to kill for a bit of rune income early on. But there are several documented cases of Wandering Nobles behaving in ways that don't fit their basic AI pattern. In certain locations, they've been observed performing gestures, actual player gestures, the kind of gestures you earn through quest lines or find as items. There's one reported instance of a Wandering Noble performing what appears to be a prayer gesture near a minor Erdtree. This was documented in a post-launch patch, so it's not something that got patched out early and disappeared. It persisted. The standard explanation would be an animation bug, a situation where the wrong animation file gets called due to a state error in the AI. That's plausible. But the gesture in question, the prayer gesture near the Erdtree, is contextually coherent. A wandering figure, presumably a former believer in the Golden Order, praying near a minor Erdtree in a world where the Erdtree's grace has been corrupted or withdrawn. If this is a bug, it's an oddly meaningful one. The Wandering Nobles as a group suggests something that the game doesn't fully explain, which is what happened to the ordinary people of the lands between when the shattering occurred. The game is full of powerful figures, demigods and their retinues, but the common people are mostly absent from the narrative. The wandering nobles are, possibly, what happened to some of them. Aimless, stripped of purpose, drifting between sites of former religious significance. Their behaviour patterns, their clustering near fires and erd trees, suggests they're going through the motions of a life that has lost its meaning. The gesture anomaly, if it is real and documented, suggests the game is capable of generating moments of accidental poetry through its systems, where a bug creates something that looks like it was designed, because the underlying lore supports it. The Dragon Communion altar glitch, this one, is well documented and fairly reproducible, though it seems to have different effects depending on the patch version. At the Dragon Communion altar on the peninsula south of Limgrave, where you spend dragon hearts to acquire incantations, there's a known glitch where, under certain conditions, the interaction menu can freeze. That by itself is boring. Menus freeze in games. But what makes this one interesting is what sometimes happens to the camera while the menu is frozen. In some versions of this glitch, the camera drifts, not randomly. It drifts toward the water to the south of the altar, and if you let it go, it ends up pointing at a specific patch of ocean, with nothing visible on the surface. If you break the glitch at that moment, your character's model is sometimes briefly in a different position than where you were standing, as if the game tried to move you toward whatever the camera was looking at. Several players who investigated this spent time searching that particular patch of water and found, not far beneath the surface, a large architectural feature that's invisible from the surface. A submerged structure that doesn't correspond to any named location in the game. It's not Liurnia's underwater areas. It's not a map dungeon. It's just there. The structure itself is incomplete in terms of geometry. It looks like a placeholder, the kind of rough collision mesh you see in parts of the game that were meant to have content added and never did. But its placement, directly where the camera glitch was pointing, is notable. The lore of the coastal cave area and the Dragon Communion altar involves the worms, the lesser dragons that predate the true dragons encountered later in the game. The item descriptions for early dragon-related items suggest the coastline around Limgrave was once a site of dragon activity long before the current age. If this submerged structure is a remnant of that older presence, it would be consistent with the game's practice of burying older history beneath newer geography. But because it's geometrically incomplete, we can't know if it was intentional or just a leftover from an early build of that area. What we can say is that the camera glitch was, in effect, pointing at something real, something that's in the game's data, even if it's not in the game's map. The night sky anomaly Elden Ring has a dynamic sky system, and it's one of the more beautiful technical elements of the game. The sky changes based on location, time of cycle, weather, and proximity to certain landmarks. Near the Erd tree, the sky has a golden quality. In Caelid, it's permanently red-shifted, stained by the scarlet rot. In the underground areas, the sky is replaced by a procedural star field that suggests you're looking up at something other than the lands between surface. But there's an anomaly in the night sky that affects the surface areas, and it's one that most players never notice, because it requires you to be standing in a specific location and looking in a specific direction at a specific time of the game's day cycle. In the mountaintops of the Giants, in the area near the forge, if you look southeast on a clear night cycle, there's a star configuration in the sky that doesn't appear anywhere else in the game. It's not a major feature, it's easy to miss. But players who have done comparative work on the game's sky textures have noted that this configuration matches the sky visible from inside Farum Azula. Farum Azula is not geographically connected to the mountaintops of the Giants in any literal sense. Farum Azula is described as a place that has been severed from the current world, existing in a kind of temporal suspension. Its sky, which is permanently stormy and includes a distinctive star field visible through breaks in the clouds, is supposed to be a sky that no longer exists in the present age. The fact that this sky is briefly visible from the mountaintops of the giants is either a rendering artifact, a situation where a sky texture that's supposed to be exclusive to Farum Azula bleeds through in certain conditions, or it's an intentional detail suggesting a spatial or temporal proximity between the two locations that the rest of the game doesn't explicitly establish. One possible reading is that the mountaintops of the giants, as the site of the Forge of the Giants and the location where the Erdtree's fundamental history is most physically concentrated, is the place in the lands between that is closest to Farum Azula in some metaphysical sense. The giants existed before the current age. They worshipped the fell god, and their forge is described as a remnant of a power that predates the Erdtree's dominance. If Farum Azula is a place frozen in an older time, and the mountaintops is the place where the current age most explicitly rests on top of an older one, then their skies briefly overlapping isn't impossible as a piece of intentional design. It's the kind of detail that From Software does include deliberately. They've done it before in other games, but it's also the kind of artifact that can appear accidentally in large open-world games with complex sky rendering systems. I genuinely can't tell you which one it is. That's part of what makes it interesting. The Erdtree's second root system, most players who have explored the underground areas of Elden Ring will have seen the roots. The Erdtree's root system extends downward through the entire world, reaching from the surface into the Siofra River, Ainsel River, and Deeproot depths. The roots are massive. They're a major environmental feature. They're described in lore terms as the physical expression of the Erdtree's dominance over the world, its grip on both the living and the dead. But there's a second root system that most players don't notice, and it doesn't belong to the Erdtree. Deep in the Deeproot depths, past the Crucible Knight bosses, in the areas leading toward the Elden Throne's basement levels, there are roots visible that are visually distinct from the Erdtree's. The Erdtree's roots are golden, warm in colour, unmistakably associated with the iconography of grace and the Golden Order. These other roots are different. They're darker, more gnarled, and they seem to originate from a different direction entirely, coming up from below rather than down from above. The lore doesn't name these roots directly, but item descriptions and environmental context in the Deeproot depths suggest that the Deeproot area predates the Erdtree. The Crucible is referenced throughout the game as the primordial state of life in the lands between, a condition that existed before the Erdtree, before the Golden Order, before the current gods. The Crucible Knights themselves are described as warriors from that earlier era, armoured in the Crucible's aspect. These darker roots, one possible reading suggests, are what remains of whatever the world's life-sustaining system was before the Erdtree replaced it. If the Erdtree is a replacement, or an imposition, or a new growth over an older foundation, then there might be structural remnants of that older foundation visible in the deepest parts of the world, in the places the Erdtree's roots haven't fully reached. The anomaly here isn't a glitch. It's an environmental detail that most players walk past without noticing, because the Deeproot depths is a difficult area, and most people are focused on not dying. But when you stop and look at those darker roots and compare them to the Erdtree's roots, the difference is obvious. Someone made them different on purpose. The Soldier of Godric dialogue loop this is a fairly well-known bug among people who have explored Stormveil thoroughly, but it's worth discussing in this context because of what it implies about the game's dialogue system. There's a soldier enemy type in Stormveil, the Soldiers of Godric, who are distinct from the grafted scions and the more heavily modified enemies. They're basic humanoid fighters. Some of them are scripted with dialogue triggers, meaning they'll say something when you approach or when they enter combat. Most of this dialogue is generic combat barking, the kind of thing any enemy might say. But there's at least one documented case of a Soldier of Godric in a specific location in the castle entering a dialogue loop, repeatedly speaking a line that seems to be intended for a different context entirely. The line, roughly, refers to the castle falling, and something about the sky being wrong. The exact wording varies in different reports, which is itself interesting, possibly because the game's text rendering for this kind of ambient dialogue isn't deterministic. The phrase about the sky being wrong is notable because it doesn't match the expected combat archetype. It sounds more like environmental storytelling dialogue, the kind of line that would be delivered by an NPC who is commenting on the state of the world. The soldiers of Godric, being enemies, don't have that kind of dialogue in their documented script files. The best technical explanation is that this particular enemy has a misassigned dialogue reference, meaning the game is calling a line that was intended for a different character or a different context. And it's calling it in a loop because the state machine isn't clearing the trigger properly. But the content of the line, the sky being wrong, connects to something. Stormvale Castle is in Limgrave, and Limgrave is one of the areas where the Erdtree is most visible on the horizon. The Erdtree's appearance has changed since the Shattering. The item descriptions and NPC dialogue throughout the early game repeatedly reference characters noticing that something about the Erdtree's light or behaviour has changed. If a soldier stationed in that castle, looking at the Erdtree on the horizon every day, began to notice that the sky around it looked different, that would be consistent with the larger lore. The dialogue loop is probably a bug, but it's a bug that, accidentally or not, connects to a real thread in the game's world. The invisible floor in Raya Lucaria Academy is already a strange place. It's a floating magical institution. Its architecture is a mix of functional academic space and deeply weird esoteric design, and its enemy types include everything from basic academy soldiers to animated skeletons to enormous magical constructs. The place is meant to feel slightly wrong, the way any institution built on the premise that you can bend the rules of reality would feel slightly wrong. But there's a specific anomaly in Raya Lucaria that goes beyond the intended atmosphere. In the upper library area, above where Renala is encountered, there's a section of floor that is visually present, meaning you can see the textures and geometry, but which has no collision in certain patches. Players fall through it. This is, at a basic level, a clipping bug. The floor looks like a floor, but isn't. What makes this interesting is where you end up if you fall through it. You don't fall out of bounds in the way you'd expect. You fall into a small contained space that appears to be an older version of the same room, with slightly different geometry, different proportions, and different item placement. Some players have reported finding items in this space that don't match the current version of the room, items that appear to be from an earlier build of the Academy. The most frequently reported item is a set of notes that don't correspond to any item in the game's shipped data, meaning they either don't display properly or they're accessing placeholder text from development. The text that players have reported seeing, and this is filtered through screenshot quality and the potential for misremembering, appears to reference Renala's early research into the moon. Not the full moon magic that she's associated with in the final game, but something more preliminary. References to the moon as a force of revision rather than light. This connects to one of the more genuinely interesting mysteries in Elden Ring's lore, which is the question of what exactly the moon was in the original version of the world. Renala's full incantations and Ranni's questline both gesture toward a cosmology that involves the moon as an alternative to the Erdtree's dominance, a force of change and revision set against the Erdtree's fixity and preservation. If Renala's early research was exploring this, and if that research was part of a version of the Academy that existed before the current build, then finding traces of it beneath the current floor is consistent with how the game builds its history, layer on layer. The Caelid bird-watching problem. The Caelid region is where a lot of the game's most aggressive environmental anomalies are concentrated, which makes a kind of sense given that Caelid is a place that has been catastrophically altered by the Scarlet Rot. The landscape is wrong. The sky is wrong. The animals that survived the rot are wrong. The giant birds of Caelid are among the most memorable wrong things in the region, aggressive to a degree that seems almost personal, and capable of one-hit killing unprepared players in a way that the game's tutorials do absolutely nothing to warn you about. But there's a behavioural anomaly in the Caelid birds that goes beyond their scripted aggression. In certain locations in Caelid, particularly around the Bestial Sanctum and the northern reaches near the border of the mountaintops, birds have been observed doing something that doesn't match their basic AI. They circle. Not in the way birds circle in games as an idle animation. They circle in a pattern over a specific point on the ground, in a way that players have described as deliberately indicating something below them. In at least 2 of the documented cases, players investigated what the birds were circling and found items. Not in obvious locations. Not on the ground in plain sight. Hidden in the terrain, in the gaps between rocks, or in shallow water. Items that had no map marker and no obvious reason to be there. This could be intentional design. From Software is known for hiding items in ways that require environmental awareness to find, and using enemy behaviour or environmental details to hint at hidden item locations is something the studio has done since the Demon's Souls era. It's entirely possible that those birds were placed to circle those locations as a design choice. But it's weird, because the birds are hostile. They're not neutral environmental hints, they're enemies. If they were designed to point players toward hidden items, that would be a choice to use an aggressive enemy in a guidance role, which is an unusual move. Most designers use neutral or passive elements for that kind of hint. The alternative reading is that the birds are responding to something in the terrain that the player can't see. Caelid's rot has affected everything in the region in ways that the lore suggests go beyond the visible changes. If the rot has altered the ground chemistry of Caelid in ways that animals can detect, and if those items were placed in locations with unusual ground characteristics, then the birds might be circling in response to whatever they can sense at those spots. This is probably overthinking a game mechanic, but the Scarlet Rot's effects on the natural world of Caelid are described in enough detail throughout item descriptions to make this at least a coherent interpretation. The Carrion Study Hall inversion this is one of the most visually striking anomalies in the game, and unlike many of the others discussed in this video, it's entirely intentional. The Carrion Study Hall is a location that can be inverted, flipped literally upside down, by using a specific item. When you invert the hall, the entire space rotates 180 degrees and what was the floor becomes the ceiling. The anomaly isn't in the inversion itself. The anomaly is in what's visible during the transition, specifically in the brief moment when the hall is rotating, when neither orientation is fully established. During that moment, players with a good eye have noticed that there are additional details visible in the space that are not present in either the normal or inverted version of the hall. Architectural elements that don't belong to either orientation. Shadows cast by objects that don't exist. A brief view through a window that shows a landscape that isn't the landscape outside the Carrion Study Hall. This is almost certainly a rendering artifact. The game's engine, during the transition between states, is briefly in a condition where it's drawing elements from both states simultaneously, and some of those elements are fighting each other in ways that produce visible anomalies. The extra shadows and the wrong landscape view are likely the result of the engine drawing both the normal and inverted states at the same time before it finishes the transition. But what makes this interesting from a lore perspective is that the Carrion Study Hall is a place of knowledge, specifically knowledge about the moon, and the relationship between the moon sorceries and the Erdtree's dominance. Ranni's questline, which goes through this hall in inverted form, is about revision and change, about seeing the world from a different angle and understanding that what appears fixed is not. The visual anomaly during the inversion, where the space briefly contains elements from 2 conflicting states, is a visual metaphor for exactly what Rani is doing, and it's happening because the game's engine literally can't decide what version of reality to show you in that moment. Whether that's intentional or not, it works. The Margit encounter scripting error. Margit, the Fell Omen, is, for most players, the first genuinely difficult boss in Elden Ring, and the encounter is carefully designed to feel like a meaningful threshold, the first test of whether you've understood the game's combat language. His moveset is well documented by now. His dialogue during the fight is familiar to anyone who has spent time with the game. But there's a documented scripting error in the Margit encounter that changes his behaviour under specific circumstances. If you reach the fog gate for Margit having already completed a specific set of actions in the world, specifically related to the Round Table Hold and Melina's early questline, Margit's pre-fight dialogue sequence sometimes fires. The lines he speaks are contextually incorrect for a first encounter. They're lines that suggest a second encounter, a follow-up, as if the game thinks you've already fought him once. The most likely explanation is that the game is misreading a progress flag, confusing the Morgott encounter in Lendel with the Margit encounter at Stormvale, since Morgott is Margit's true form and they share dialogue. A flag that's supposed to be set after the Morgott fight is being set early, and the Margit encounter is reading that flag and acting as if you've already had the conversation with his truer self. The lore implication is interesting despite the technical explanation being mundane. Margit and Morgott are the same being, and the connection between them is one of the more emotionally complex pieces of Elden Ring's story. Morgott is the last omen, a being who has been persecuted for his nature, who believes in the sanctity of the Golden Order despite the Order having condemned his existence, and who fights you out of genuine conviction rather than corruption or madness. When Margit's dialogue accidentally references the Morgott context, it's accidentally revealing something true about the character, which is that the distinction between Margit and Morgott is more of a mask than a real separation. The scripting error, in other words, accidentally tells the truth about the character in a way the scripted encounter doesn't. The Lake of Rot's missing sound design. Elden Ring's sound design is exceptional throughout, and the audio team clearly put serious effort into making every environment feel distinct and alive. The underground areas in particular have audio that rewards close listening, with ambient sounds that change based on proximity to specific features, acoustic effects that reflect the physical spaces, and occasional audio events that seem to be commenting on the lore of the area. The Lake of Rot is one of the most hostile environments in the game. It's a vast underground lake filled with scarlet rot that will kill you quickly if you're not resistant to it. The visual design is striking, red-lit, claustrophobic in its openness, if that makes sense. A huge space that feels suffocating. The environmental storytelling through items and architecture is rich with references to Estelle and the broader history of the underground. But the Lake of Rot has a sound design anomaly. In specific locations on the lake's surface, there are patches of silence that don't match the surrounding audio. The Rot Lake has a consistent ambient audio loop, a wet, corrosive sound that changes slightly as these silent patches break that loop. They're not quieter, they're genuinely silent in a way that stands out against the lake's normal audio. Players who have mapped these silent patches have found that they correspond roughly to the positions of structures visible beneath the lake's surface. The lake isn't uniformly deep. There are buildings down there, older structures that were submerged when the rot expanded, and the silent patches seem to be above those structures. The lore-adjacent reading is that the rot hasn't fully penetrated those structures, and the silence is the game's audio system registering the absence of rot in those specific columns of water above the buried buildings. If the rot's audio is a function of the rot's physical presence, and if those structures are blocking the rot, then the audio silence makes physical sense, even if it was probably unintentional. The more unsettling reading, and this is speculation, is that something is in those buildings. The silence of a living thing that is aware of you is a different sound than the silence of an empty space. The Lake of Rot has enemies, but they're distributed throughout the visible surface. Below the surface, in those buildings, there's nothing confirmed. But the silence sits wrong. The Mogwyn Palace constellation Mogwyn Palace is accessed either through Vare's questline or through a teleporter in the consecrated snowfield, and it's one of the more deliberately strange areas in the game. It's a buried palace filled with blood, literally filled, rivers and pools of blood that suggest a scale of sacrifice that the game doesn't entirely explain. The Albinaurics who are being killed here, the war between the dynasty soldiers and the sanguine nobles, the presence of Mog, Lord of Blood, as a god building something new in the wreckage of the old order, all of this makes Mogwyn one of the more narratively dense areas in the game. The ceiling of Mogwyn Palace is a fake sky. The area is underground, but the designers created a sky effect above the palace that mimics a night sky, complete with what appears to be a constellation pattern. Most players notice this and file it under atmospheric design. But the constellation isn't random. Players who have studied the sky in Mogwyn and compared it to the star patterns visible in other parts of the game have found that the constellation pattern in Mogwyn doesn't match any sky visible on the Lands Between's surface. It's not a copy of the night sky from Limgrave or Liurnia or the mountaintops. It's a completely unique configuration. One possible reading is that this is the sky of the outer god that Mog serves. The description of outer gods in Elden Ring's lore suggests these are beings outside the world's normal cosmology, beings with their own metaphysical presence. Mog's patron, the Formless Mother, is one of the outer gods, and her influence in the palace is described as a kind of divine intrusion, a bleeding through of something external into the world of the Lands Between. If the fake sky in Mogwyn Palace shows the constellation of the Formless Mother's domain, that would be an extraordinary piece of environmental storytelling. A god's home sky, made visible in the place where her chosen is trying to establish her presence in the world. It might also just be a placeholder texture. The honest answer is that this detail isn't confirmed either way. But the care that went into every other aspect of Mogwyn's design makes it hard to dismiss. The round table hold geometry error. The round table hold is the game's central hub, the place where the main NPCs gather, and where most of the game's progression-related conversations happen. It's designed to feel like a neutral space, outside the normal flow of the Lands Between, a place maintained by some other power separate from the Erdtree's influence. There's a geometry anomaly in the round table hold that most players never see. In the room past the two fingers, through the hall that leads to Gideon Offner's study, there's a wall that has no collision in a very specific location. It's a narrow gap, easy to miss, and it requires specific positioning to slip through. But if you do get through it, you find yourself in a small space behind the wall that is geometrically inconsistent with the rest of the hold. The space has a different floor texture, different lighting, and on the ceiling there's an architectural element that doesn't belong to the round table's visual vocabulary. It looks like it belongs to a different building entirely, specifically to the kind of Erdtree-adjacent architecture you see in Lendel. The most plausible explanation is that this is a leftover from an earlier version of the round table hold, possibly a version where the hold was more explicitly connected to Lendel than it is in the final game. The hold's lore suggests it was created as a meeting place for Tarnished, separate from the Erdtree's direct influence, but also not entirely independent of the broader Golden Order structure. An earlier version of the hold might have made that connection more physically explicit. What this suggests about the hold's lore is that the separation between the hold and the Golden Order might be less complete than the game implies. The two fingers are described as intermediaries for the Greater Will, which is associated with the Erdtree and the Golden Order. If the Round Table hold has Lendel architecture hidden in its walls, the implication is that it was built, at some point, as an extension of the same power rather than as a genuinely neutral space. The Faramazula time loop glitch crumbling Faramazula is described in the lore as a place frozen in time, a city that was lifted into the sky and disconnected from the normal flow of events in the lands between. The architecture is crumbling, the beastmen who inhabit it are remnants of an older era, and the entire area exists in a permanent storm that the game describes as a tempest of time. There's a documented glitch in Faramazula where certain moving platforms or environmental features reset in ways that suggest the game's internal timer is behaving differently in this area than it does elsewhere. Most notably, some enemy positions reset at intervals that don't correspond to the game's normal respawn logic. In other areas, enemies respawn when you rest at a site of grace. In Faramazula, there are documented cases of specific enemies resetting before you've rested, sometimes while you're still in the same room, simply waiting. The technical explanation is probably related to the game handling the area's unique environmental mechanics, specifically the storm effects and the moving terrain, in ways that sometimes interfere with the standard enemy state management. The area is genuinely complicated to navigate, and its geometry is unusual, but the lore reading is irresistible. If Faramazula is frozen in time, and if the game's enemy state logic is occasionally resetting as if time is looping, then the enemies of Faramazula are, in the game's own systems, experiencing something that resembles the temporal dislocation described in the lore. They reset because the area's time resets. The glitch is enacting the lore. This is the kind of coincidence that you can't verify as intentional, but that's too coherent to dismiss entirely. The Erdtree's absent shadow, this one, takes some looking, but once you see it, it's hard to unsee. The Erdtree casts light. It's the primary light source for much of the lands between, and the golden light from the Erdtree is a constant ambient presence in the surface areas. The game's lighting system handles this by giving the Erdtree a kind of directional light contribution that affects how shadows fall across the terrain. The anomaly is that the Erdtree itself casts no shadow. This is technically by design. The Erdtree is so large and so central to the world that making it cast a geometrically accurate shadow would require the shadow to cover enormous portions of the map at specific times of day, which would be computationally expensive and potentially disruptive to the game's art direction. The decision to not have the Erdtree cast a shadow is a practical one, but the lore implications are genuinely unsettling. Things that exist in the physical world cast shadows. Things that are purely light, purely projected, purely conceptual, do not. If the Erdtree casts no shadow, one possible reading is that the Erdtree is not entirely physically present in the. It's a projection, a planted concept, a thing that exists more as an idea or a divine presence than as a tree growing in real soil. The lore supports this in ways that become clearer in the late game. The Erdtree's relationship to the physical world is complicated. It doesn't just grow. It was planted or manifested through the intervention of the greater will and the two fingers. Its roots, which go so deep into the underground, are less a tree's root system and more a system of control and connection. The Erdtree is an interface between the greater will and the world, and interfaces don't necessarily have to be physically real in the way a tree is real. The absent shadow is probably just a rendering, but it's a rendering choice that accidentally tells you something about what the Erdtree actually is. The Sorcerer Jarhead Anomaly, the Living Jar enemies in Elden Ring, are one of the more unique enemy designs in the game, ceramic jars animated by the will of the spirits contained within them. Their lore is actually quite sad, jars that have been filled with the remains of warriors, animated so that the spirits can continue fighting, existing in a kind of eternal service that they didn't choose. There are larger versions, the Erdtree avatars and their variants, and there are smaller versions used as players can become allied with, like Iron Fist Alexander. But there's a specific variant in the Academy that has an anomaly. In Raya Lucaria, there are Sorcerer Jar enemies, jars that have been animated using sorceress techniques rather than the standard Erdtree method. Most of these have the standard jar body with a relatively blank face, expressive in the way that a painted ceramic jar can be expressive. But at least one specific sorcerer jar in the Academy, reported in the upper levels near the spinning crystal contraptions, has a head model that briefly flickers to a different model when hit at a specific angle or under specific lighting conditions. The replacement model that flickers in is a human face, not a simplified or abstracted human face. A detailed one. This could be a LOD switching error, a situation where the game's level of detail system is swapping between the jar face model and a human face model that shouldn't be active for this enemy type. But it's a pretty specific and unusual error if that's what it is. The face in question doesn't correspond to any named NPC in the game that players have been able to match it to. The lore reading would be that the spirit inside this particular jar is closer to the surface than in other jars, more present, more insistent on being seen. The sorceress method of animation used in Raya Lucaria might be less controlled than the Erdtree method, less able to fully submerge the identity of the spirit within. And if the spirit inside was a sorcerer, or someone who died in the Academy, their face might be trying to assert itself through the jar's exterior. The deep-root depth singing of all the audio anomalies in Elden Ring, the one reported in the deep-root depths, is the most consistently described and the hardest to dismiss as simple environmental audio. In the deep-root depths, in the areas beyond the Elden Throne's basement levels, and before the Godwyn the Golden encounter, players have reported hearing what sounds like a human voice singing. Not a battle cry, not an enemy vocalization, an actual melodic line, brief, recurring, coming from a direction that players consistently describe as downward. The deep-root depths does have a complex ambient audio setup. The area is deep underground, it's connected to the roots of the Erdtree, it has proximity to the resting place of Godwyn the Golden, and the whole space has a quality that the game's audio team clearly worked hard to make distinct. There's a deep resonance throughout the deep-root that isn't present in the other underground areas. But singing is specific. Several players have recorded what they believe to be this audio event, and while the recordings vary in quality, there's a consistent melodic fragment that appears in multiple captures from different players in similar areas of the deep-root depths. Godwyn the Golden is one of the most interesting figures in Elden Ring's lore. He was the first to die of the demigods, but the manner of his death was unique. Ranni orchestrated an event in which her soul died but her body survived, while Godwyn's soul survived but his body died. This inversion means Godwyn's body still exists in the deep-root depths, enormous, still growing, merging with the roots of the Erdtree in a process that the lore describes as a kind of terrible, ongoing transformation. His soul, having no body, was described as scattered or lost, but some fragments in the game suggest his soul didn't entirely dissipate. It exists in a form that can't be fully articulated, present in the roots, present in the death root that spreads from his body, present in the places where his body's influence has spread. If something of Godwyn's consciousness remains, distributed through the roots, and if that consciousness is capable of producing sound through the material it inhabits, then the singing in the deep-root depths might be the ghost of the first Prince of Death, scattered and incomplete, still here in some form. This is absolutely speculation. The singing might be environmental audio that doesn't reference Godwyn at all, but it's singing that comes from below, in the place where Godwyn's body lies, and it's the only location in the game where this specific audio event has been documented. The Liurnia of the Lake's Reflection Problem Liurnia is built around a body of water that covers most of the region's surface. The lake is vast, its floor mostly invisible from the surface, and the water has a quality that the game's visual team rendered with a lot of care. The reflections on the water's surface show the sky, the Erdtree, and the Academy in the distance, but there are locations in Liurnia where the water's reflection shows something that isn't there. In the northwestern areas of the lake, away from the main road and away from the Academy, there are patches of water where the reflection includes architectural elements that don't correspond to any structures visible on the surface or underwater. Specifically, the reflection shows what appears to be a tower or spire that isn't present in the current geography of Liurnia. Players who have mapped this reflection have found that the reflected structure corresponds, in position and basic shape, to one of the older structures visible at the bottom of the lake in the areas where the water is shallow enough to see the floor, a structure that appears to have predated whatever event flooded Liurnia. The lore of Liurnia supports the idea that the region was dramatically changed by the conflict between Caria and Raya Lucaria. The current flooded state isn't how the region always looked. Before the flood, there were presumably more structures, more roads, more of a functional landscape. The Carian Manor, now accessible only through the northwestern edge of the region, is the remnant of a much older Carian presence that predates the Academy. If the underwater ruins are from that older Liurnia, and if the reflection is showing those ruins in a way that suggests the lake is showing you the world as it used to be, then this is either an extraordinary piece of environmental storytelling or a water reflection rendering error that happens to be contextually coherent. The Haligtree's incomplete architecture. The Miquella's Haligtree is one of the most ambitious structures in the game, a vast tree that Miquella grew through the application of his unique form of unalloyed gold, attempting to create a sanctuary outside the Greater Will's influence. The scale of it is extraordinary. The branches extend for what would be hundreds of meters in any real-world scale reference, and the structures built into and around the tree are architecturally detailed in ways that reward close attention. But there are sections of the Haligtree that are visibly incomplete. Not incomplete in the way that a ruined or abandoned building looks incomplete. Incomplete in the way that a game asset looks when it hasn't been finished. Missing textures, placeholder geometry, gaps in the collision mesh. These sections are in areas that players don't typically reach during normal gameplay, requiring deliberate out-of-bounds exploration to access. The interesting thing about these incomplete sections isn't the incompleteness itself, which is normal for any large game. It's where they are. The incomplete sections of the Haligtree are concentrated in the areas that would, based on the tree's geometry, correspond to its higher branches, the parts of the tree furthest from the ground. The implication is that the Haligtree was planned to be larger than it is. There were going to be higher branches, more of the tree accessible. Possibly more of the world Miquella was building visible at greater heights. The completed version of the Haligtree, in other words, might have been taller and more extensive than the version in the finished game. This connects to Miquella's story in a specific way. Miquella's project is described as incomplete. He was captured by Mog before his work on the Haligtree was finished, and the tree itself is described as still growing, still developing, waiting for Miquella to return and complete his vision. If the game's asset geometry reflects the story, then the incomplete sections of the Haligtree aren't just development leftovers. They're the physical expression of Miquella's interrupted project. Whether this was intentional, a case where the developers deliberately left the higher branches unfinished to match the lore, or whether the lore was written to account for the practical limitation of not finishing the whole tree, is impossible to determine from the outside. But the coherence between the incomplete geometry and the incomplete narrative is notable. The Malenia animation error Malenia, Blade of Miquella, is the game's most infamous optional boss, the hardest enemy in a game full of hard enemies, and one of the most technically and artistically detailed boss encounters in the entire Soulsborne catalogue. Her design is exceptional, her moveset is extensively documented, her lore position in the game's larger story is one of the most significant of any character. She also has a documented animation error that most players will never see. During the Scarlet Aeonia attack, the large bloom attack that begins Malenia's second phase, there's a specific window where Malenia's model briefly enters an unintended animation state if the attack is interrupted in a very specific way. This requires a precise combination of damage type, timing, and positioning, and the window for it is small enough that it essentially never happens in normal play. If it does occur, Malenia's model briefly displays a different posture, a collapsed or curled position that doesn't match any of her standard animations. The position is humanizing in a way that her normal animations aren't. Malenia's normal animations are all controlled, deliberate, expressive of a warrior who has absolute mastery over her body despite the rot. This brief error posture looks tired. It looks like someone who has been fighting for a very long time and is simply exhausted. The lore context is that Malenia has been fighting the scarlet rot within her own body for her entire life. Her existence is an ongoing battle, not just the fight you're having with her, but a constant internal war against the divine curse she was born with. Her animation language in the boss fight is the performance of victory over that rot, the constant assertion of control. The error animation, the brief collapse, suggests what's underneath the performance. This is almost certainly not intentional. Animation errors don't contain intentional lore content. But the error animation is consistent with what we know about Malenia's internal state, and its brief appearance during the most dramatic moment of the fight. The moment when the rot temporarily wins and blooms into the world gives it a poetic coherence that the developers probably didn't plan. The Nokron Celestial Dew Origin Nokron Eternal City is one of the game's most visually distinctive areas, an underground city that was partially destroyed when Radahn's gravity magic was disrupted following his defeat, and which now has stars and celestial light filtering down from above despite being deep underground. The stars are real in some sense, not projected, not fake, but actually visible from Nokron, suggesting a connection between the city and the actual sky that the normal underground areas don't have. The celestial dew item, found in Nokron and related areas, is described as a dew that collects from celestial sources in the underground. It's used for atonement at the Church of Vows, clearing your record of aggression toward NPCs. Its description connects it to the celestial quality of Nokron and the Eternal City. But there's an anomaly in how celestial dew spawns in Nokron. Players who have run the area repeatedly for farming purposes have noted that celestial dew respawn locations are not consistent. Unlike most items that have fixed spawn points and fixed respawn behavior, celestial dew sometimes appears in locations where it wasn't in the previous run, and sometimes doesn't appear in locations where it was. The movement isn't random in the way a random drop would be. It seems to migrate over time, appearing in different spots in the same general areas, as if it's actually collecting somewhere and then being replenished. The lore-adjacent explanation is that celestial dew is actually behaving like dew, collecting and evaporating and recollecting based on some internal logic that the game is running. If the celestial light from above Nokron is functionally real, creating actual atmospheric conditions in the city, then a substance described as dew might genuinely be forming, moving, and reforming based on conditions the player can't directly observe. This is a stretch. The more likely explanation is that the game's loot table system for Nokron has some randomization in spawn points rather than a fully fixed map, but the item behaves as if it's real in a way that other items don't, and the description supports the behavior. The Elden Beast's pre-fight behavior. The Elden Beast is the final boss of the game, the physical manifestation of the Elden Ring as a divine being, the will of the greater will made flesh in the world. The fight is extraordinary, and the design of the Elden Beast is one of the most ambitious pieces of creature design in the game. But there's a window before the fight actually begins, where the Elden Beast's behavior is documented as anomalous. When you reach the boss area, after the fog gate, there's a brief period before the Elden Beast registers your presence and initiates combat. During this window, the Elden Beast is in what should be an idle state, moving slowly or hovering. But players who have observed it carefully during this window have noted that the Elden Beast's movement during the pre-fight window is not random. It appears to be doing something. Several players have described the Elden Beast as appearing to examine the player character during this window. Orienting toward them, moving closer, pausing, the behavior resembles the kind of investigative, idle behavior you see in some AI systems, where an enemy in a passive state has detected something but hasn't yet switched to an active state. But the Elden Beast's pre-combat AI isn't supposed to include investigative behavior. It should be fully passive until the fight trigger fires. What this behavior might represent in lore terms is one of the more interesting questions in the game. The Elden Beast is the Elden Ring given physical form, the accumulated order of the greater will made manifest. The Tarnished, who reaches it, has broken through every barrier the greater will erected, killed every demigod, and arrived at the literal centre of the game's divine order. The investigative pause, if it's real and not just an artifact of how players describe what they see in that high-stress moment before a final boss fight, might be the Elden Beast recognizing something about the Tarnished. The Greater Will's design, according to various possible readings of the lore, may have always included the possibility of a Tarnished reaching this point and either restoring the ring or shattering the existing order further. The Elden Beast examining the player before fighting might be the moment of that recognition. It might also just be a camera and animation artifact in a high-poly environment, but the pause is real. Multiple players have noted it. And it happens at the most significant threshold in the game. The minor Erd tree bloom timing the minor Erd trees scattered across the lands between as smaller versions of the main Erd tree, and they serve several functions in the game's world. They're sites of grace, they're associated with nearby dungeons and environmental storytelling, and several of them are involved in quests and progression. But they also bloom. At specific times in the game's day cycle, the minor Erd trees produce a burst of golden light and particles that resembles a bloom or flowering event. This is a visual effect, clearly intentional, and it's beautiful in context. The anomaly is in the timing. Players who have observed multiple minor Erd trees across different areas have noted that the bloom events don't happen on a synchronized timer. Each minor Erd tree blooms at a slightly different time, and the timing appears to correlate with the Erd tree's position relative to the main Erd tree, and also with the state of the surrounding environment. Minor Erd trees in heavily corrupted or damaged areas bloom less frequently, or produce a diminished effect. The one in Caelid barely blooms at all. The ones in healthier areas bloom more regularly, and the timing across all of them, when mapped, suggests they're not operating on a simple timer, but on some kind of relational logic. The lore context is that the minor Erd trees are described as extensions of the main Erd tree, drawing on the same source of divine energy. If the main Erd tree's condition affects the minor Erd trees, and if the local environment's condition affects how each minor Erd tree can express the energy it receives, then the bloom timing variation is consistent with a model where each tree is operating as a node in a damaged network, receiving different amounts of power and expressing it according to local conditions. This is probably an intentional design feature that communicates something about the state of the world through visual systems rather than text. But it's subtle enough that most players don't notice it, and those who do aren't always sure whether they're observing design or projection. The Godfrey footprint gravity theirs as a mechanic in the Lendel fight with Godfrey's ghost, or more precisely in the approach to the Godfrey boss arena that involves the enormous footprints left in the stone floor of Lendel. These footprints are established early as a piece of environmental storytelling, the physical impression of an impossibly powerful being in stone that shouldn't be able to hold that impression. Players have noted that these footprints have a subtle gravitational pull effect, not enough to move the player character in any means, but enough to register as an environmental interaction that isn't present in the surrounding floor. The player's movement is slightly altered when crossing these prints, a micro stagger or directional nudge that's easy to miss but detectable when you're looking. This is either a deliberate collision design choice, where the designers gave the footprints slightly convex geometry that produces the nudging effect, or it's a physics artifact where the depression geometry of the footprint interacts with the character controller in an unintended. In lore terms, the idea that Godfrey's footprints still exert some kind of force on the world is consistent with the game's treatment of his character. Godfrey is described as the first Elden Lord, a being of extraordinary martial power, and the first Tarnished, exiled from the lands between when the greater will deemed his grace extinguished. But his physical impression on the world persists despite his absence and his exile. If the game's physics system is registering something at those footprints that it doesn't register elsewhere, there's a lore-coherent explanation for why that would be. The Stormveil Crow ritual there's a specific location in Stormveil Castle, on the upper ramparts, where a cluster of the giant crows that are native to the area are gathered around what appears to be a corpse. The crows in Elden Ring are aggressive and territorial, and finding a cluster of them around a body is contextually normal. Crows eat the dead. This is fine. What's not entirely normal is the arrangement of the crows. They're not feeding, they're standing in a pattern around the body that players have described as ritualistic. There are feathers arranged around the body in a way that doesn't look like the residue of a fight. The crows are standing at specific intervals, not crowding toward the food source the way animals typically behave. Some players have spent time observing this cluster without disturbing it, and have noted that the crows periodically move. Not randomly, not because they've detected the player. They shift positions in a pattern that repeats. As if they're doing something or enacting something in slow rotations. This is almost certainly AI behavior that is using a combination of idle animations and position updates in a way that looks deliberate from a certain angle. Groups of the same enemy type sharing proximity will sometimes produce behavior that looks coordinated because their individual AI states happen to align. But the crows of Elden Ring have lore. The item descriptions related to crow feathers and the crow enemies connect them to fortune-telling and omens in the Lands Between's older traditions. Before the Golden Order standardized religious practice, many communities in the Lands Between used birds, and crows specifically, as intermediaries with the beyond. If the crows on that rampart are performing something, it's consistent with a tradition that predates the Golden Order's authority. The catacombs, echo the catacombs of Elden Ring, are uniformly creepy. They're small, they're full of skeletons, the lighting is oppressive, and the dungeon design is deliberately claustrophobic. They're not designed to be comfortable spaces. But one specific catacomb, the Cliff Bottom Catacomb, has an audio anomaly that players have reported consistently enough that it's worth discussing. In one of the back rooms of this catacomb, in an area that becomes accessible after a specific lever is pulled, players have reported hearing a voice. Not enemy vocalizations. An actual spoken line. The line, as best as players have been able to determine from sounds like it's in the common language of the Lands Between, rather than one of the game's invented languages. It's described as brief, low, and sounding like a question, though the content is unclear enough that players can't agree on what it. The Cliff Bottom Catacombs are in Liurnia, and Liurnia is associated with the Carian tradition and with the broader history of sorcery in the Lands Between. The catacomb itself is associated with the Academy based on the enemy types it contains. If the voice is real, meaning if it's a genuine audio event rather than a sound bleed from somewhere else in the game's, it suggests there is dialogue scripted for this area that triggers under specific conditions and that most players never encounter. What the voice might be saying is genuinely unknown. The candidates, based on the context, include a spirit of a former Academy student, a message left deliberately by someone who used this catacomb as a meeting place, or an audio event related to the catacomb's imbued sword key connection to the four belfries. The four belfries have an explicit connection to memories and echoes of other places and times, and the imbued sword keys used to unlock them are found in part here. If the voice is a bleed from whatever the belfries connect to, it might literally be an echo from a different time, rendered briefly audible by the proximity of the keys. This is speculation layered on uncertainty, but the voice is reported consistently enough to be worth noting. The Liurnia Academy exterior window Raya Lucaria Academy is designed so that access to its interior requires crossing the bridge from the eastern side of Liurnia. The exterior of the academy is visible from many points, and its architecture is detailed and consistent from the outside. But there's a window on the academy's exterior that shows something impossible from certain vantage points in the lake. If you're in the right location in the lake, specifically in the northeastern area near the ruins, and you look at the academy at the right angle during the right lighting, there's a window on the upper floors of the academy that appears to be lit from within in a way that's inconsistent with the game's time of day. When the exterior is in shadow, this window is lit. When other windows are dark, this one is lit. The light inside it is golden, rather than the cooler light that the academy's interior sorceries. Players who investigated this and found their way to the corresponding room inside the academy found a room that was, at the time they visited, dark. The light visible from outside couldn't have been coming from inside. The lore has an interesting match for this. The academy's connection to the moon and the Carian tradition involves a form of light that isn't the standard Erdtree-associated gold, but there are also references throughout Raya Lucaria's item descriptions to the Academy's prior alignment, before Renala's fall, with both the moon tradition and the Golden Order. There was a period where the Academy served both, and the architectural design of that period might have included Golden Order lighting elements that are now inactive. If the window is showing light that exists in an older version of the room, a temporal echo of a room that was lit with Golden Order gold, then it would be consistent with the game's broader pattern of having places retain traces of what they used to be. The golden window is visible. The room is dark when you visit. What you're seeing, possibly, is the past. The Godfrey introduction mistrigger in the arena where you fight Godfrey, first Elden Lord, the proper final version and not the ghost version in Lendel. There's a cutscene that plays when you enter. Godfrey speaks, acknowledging the Tarnished as a worthy opponent, and the scene establishes the weight of the fight you're about to have. In some documented cases, this cutscene fires with subtly different timing, with a gap between the player entering the arena and the cutscene triggering. During this gap, before the cutscene, Godfrey is in an idle state, and his idle state includes him looking at his axe. Players who have watched this closely describe Godfrey in his pre-cutscene idle as appearing melancholy. The animation isn't of a warrior preparing for battle. It's of someone resting, looking at something they've carried for a long time, thinking when the cutscene then triggers and Godfrey becomes the composed, challenging opponent, the gap in the animation feels like you caught him being something other than what he performs. Godfrey's lore is in many ways the saddest in the game. He was the greatest warrior of his age, chosen by Marika, the first Elden Lord, and then discarded when his grace was extinguished. When the purpose of war was no longer needed, and the greater will decided a new phase of the age required a different kind of lord. He spent ages outside the lands between, in exile, waiting, fighting wars in the outer world to maintain his edge, in case he ever got the chance to return. The ghost form in Lendel is the echo of what he was when he left. The real Godfrey who faces you in the Erdtree has returned as a Tarnished himself, stripped of Erdtree grace, relying on raw martial ability. The brief idle animation, the looking at the axe, if it's a genuine behaviour and not a false memory, created by the stress of approaching a major boss, shows a Godfrey who has been carrying that axe for an inconceivably long time and still isn't sure what it was all for. The cutscene version of Godfrey performs certainty and dignity. The idle version, caught before the performance starts, might just be tired. The lands between border anomalies every open-world game has a border where the playable area ends. In most games, this border is handled with invisible walls, loading zones, or geography that makes it impractical to continue. Elden Ring uses a combination of all three. But the borders of the lands between have anomalies that are worth noting from a lore perspective. Players who have used exploits to travel beyond the visible borders of the game world have found that the lands between doesn't simply end. The terrain continues for some distance beyond the playable area before it starts to degrade into unfinished or missing geometry. In some directions, the extended terrain has environmental features, patches of specific biome types, the remnants of roads, water features, that suggest the playable area was carved out of a larger world that was partially built. In the direction of the ocean to the west of Limgrave, the extended terrain includes the bottom of an ocean floor that continues much further than the playable area, and in this extended ocean floor there are large structures. Not finished structures. Not named or textured in the way that playable content is finished, but structures. The scale of them suggests something significant was planned for the ocean that didn't make it into the final game. The lore of Elden Ring's Western Ocean is sparse. There are references to what lies beyond, and the story of the Tarnished originally comes from beyond the lands between. But the specific geography of the world outside the Erdtree's domain isn't described in detail. The structures on the extended ocean floor could be remnants of whatever civilization the Tarnished came from, the world outside that sent its warriors into the lands between and never got them back. They could also just be development assets from an earlier version of the map that were never fully removed. But they're there, and they're large, and they're in the direction that the lore says the outside world lies. The Bok the Seamster reflection Bok the Seamster is one of the game's more memorable NPCs, a demi-human who has been transformed into a shape resembling a tree by his fellow demi-humans as punishment, and who, when freed, becomes a tailor who works with the player character's armour. There's an anomaly in the room where Bok is encountered in his tree form. If you look at the reflection of the tree in the water on the floor of that forest area, you sometimes see a reflection that shows not the tree, but the human-adjacent form that Bok takes after you free him. His original shape reflected back where the tree should be. This is almost certainly a rendering glitch, where the water reflection system is pulling from a cached version of the geometry that was used during development before the final version of that area was finished. The tree model that Bok becomes was added at some point over whatever existed there before, and the reflection might be showing the earlier version. But if you encounter this before freeing Bok and before knowing his story, what you see in the water is an unusual figure that hints at what's inside the tree. The reflection showing the person before the transformation is completed. It's an accidental piece of foreshadowing, and it works because the lore context makes it coherent. Bok's story about being transformed against your will and struggling to remember what you were is one of the sadder questlines in the game. The reflection, accidentally showing what lies within the curse, is genuinely touching if you know what you're looking at. The Black Knife Assassin sound. The Black Knife Assassins are some of the most atmospherically well-realised enemies in the game. They're connected to one of the central crimes of Elden Ring's history, the Night of Black Knives, when Ranni's conspirators used daggers imbued with the power of death to kill Godwyn and attempt to kill other demigods. The assassins move in near silence. They're fast, and they're visually distinctive with their flowing black attire. There's a sound anomaly connected specifically to the Black Knife Assassin in the Black Knife Catacombs, the named location that explicitly references the assassin's history and serves as the area where you can find the Black Knife item and associated lore. In this location, at night in the game's day cycle, the Black Knife Assassin boss has been heard to produce a sound that doesn't appear in its standard audio set. It's a brief sound occurring between attack animations, and players who have described it say it sounds like breathing. Not the kind of generic breathing that enemies use as an ambient sound, but something more irregular, more laboured. Black Knife Assassins are described in their item descriptions as having been given something, a fragment of the Rune of Death perhaps, or a curse connected to the event they participated in. The Night of Black Knives changed them. They didn't come through it unchanged. The specific assassin in the Black Knife Catacombs is in a place built explicitly around the memory of that night. If the breathing sound is real, the context suggests someone who is still carrying the weight of what was done, an assassin who killed a prince and has been haunting the site of the crime ever since, still breathing in the way the living breathe. Because whatever was done to them in the Night of Black Knives suspended them in a state that isn't quite death and isn't quite life. The Frenzied Flame seal geometry, the Frenzied Flame prescription, is the location deep beneath Lendl where the three fingers are encountered and where the player can receive the Frenzied Flame. It's one of the most viscerally unsettling areas in the game, a sealed chamber covered in claw marks, implied to have been the prison of the three fingers and their associated divine concept. Players who have used the geometry of this room to clip out of bounds have found that the exterior of the sealed chamber is decorated on the outside. The inside is marked with claw scratches from whatever was contained within, but the outside of the same walls has markings too, formal markings, inscribed deliberately, in a script that players have described as different from any other script visible in the game's surface areas. This exterior inscription can't be seen during normal gameplay. You can only access the exterior of this chamber by going out of bounds. It wasn't designed to be seen by players. But someone made it. The inscriptions haven't been fully translated because they don't match any known in-game text font, but the style has been described as consistent with markings found on the Omen Killer's equipment, the assassins employed by the Golden Order to kill Omen children. If the exterior of the chamber where the three fingers are sealed is marked with Omen Killer inscriptions, then the seal was maintained by the same institution that hunted and killed people like Morgott and Mog. The Golden Order didn't just contain the Frenzied Flame. They used the same apparatus that committed what is effectively genocide against the Omen people to maintain that containment. The three fingers associated with the Frenzied Flame and the concept of chaos and dissolution are the counterpart to the two fingers that serve the greater will. They represent an alternative order. The fact that the Golden Order used its most brutal instrument to maintain the seal on them suggests a deep institutional fear of what the three fingers represent, and a willingness to use any means to keep it contained. All of this from a texture that was never meant to be seen. The mountaintop's breath in the mountaintops of the giants. In the open snowfields away from the main paths, there are moments when the wind dies and the ambient audio settles into a near silence. This is normal. High-altitude locations often have moments of stillness between gusts, but in a specific location in the mountaintops, between the first church of Marika and the freezing lake, there are documented instances of a sound in that near silence that players describe as breathing. Deep, slow, enormous breathing. Not a monster's breathing, not the kind of breathing that precedes an attack. A sleeping, barely there respiration that sounds too large to belong to anything the player can see. The size of the sound, if it's accurately described, would imply a creature of extraordinary scale, comparable to the giants whose bones litter the region. But the surviving giants in the mountaintops are scripted enemies with standard behaviour. They don't appear to produce this sound. The giants of the mountaintops, in the lore, are not all dead. The lore is somewhat ambiguous on this point. The giants were defeated in ancient history by Godfrey's army, but defeated doesn't necessarily mean extinct. The mountaintops have the bones of giants and the ruins of their culture, but also living fire from the fire giants, and the fire giant boss is explicitly a surviving specimen of the final war. If there are giants in the mountaintops beyond the scripted fire giant, creatures large enough that their breathing sounds like the land itself breathing, then the mountaintops are less thoroughly conquered than the Golden Order's history suggests. The giants were supposed to be gone. The forge was supposed to be empty, except for its final guardian. If something still breathes up there, still large enough to fill the wind with its respiration, then The war that defined the current age was less complete than the victors claimed. This is probably the wind. Mountain wind in games often produces audio that sounds almost organic. But the specific location of this sound, in the area between the major giant-associated landmarks, and the fact that it sounds like something sleeping rather than something ambient, makes it worth noting. The Sealed Tunnel pre-boss room. The Sealed Tunnel is a short legacy dungeon in the Altus Plateau, notable primarily for containing the Onyx Lord boss, and for serving as a connection point between the surface and the underground areas below. It's not one of the game's more extensively documented areas. But there's a room in the Sealed Tunnel, the room immediately before the Onyx Lord's arena, where the geometry is wrong in a way that players who pay close attention will notice. The ceiling height of this room is inconsistent with the ceilings in every other room in the dungeon. Every other room in the Sealed Tunnel has a consistent ceiling height that matches the dungeon's visual design. This pre-boss room has a ceiling that is noticeably high enough that the darkness above is not fully rendered, and the walls extend upward into that darkness. Players who have used the camera to look up into that darkness have sometimes reported seeing geometry up there. Unlit architecture existing above the visible ceiling of the room that doesn't correspond to the surface area above the dungeon. The Onyx Lord is described in its item drops as a being associated with meteorites and celestial objects. Onyx Lords, generally in the lore, are connected to the ancient celestial traditions that predate the Erdtree's dominance, traditions connected to astrology and the movement of stars. The Sealed Tunnel's connection to the underground river systems puts it near the world's older geological layers. What the geometry above the pre-boss room might be is unclear. It could be an unfinished section of a previously planned larger dungeon. It could be the remnant of a structure that existed above before the current surface was established. Given the Onyx Lord's lore, the hidden room above might have been intended to show something about where the Onyx Lord came from. A structure connected to the sky rather than the earth, existing in the space between the underground and the surface as a reminder that celestial beings were present in this world long before the current age. The Fingerprint Stone Shield, Secret. The Fingerprint Stone Shield is a late-game piece of equipment with one of the highest stability ratings in the game and a connection to the Three Fingers and the Frenzied Flame. Its item description references the fingerprints of the Three Fingers embedded in the stone, a physical imprint of divine contact. Players who have examined the shield's texture closely, specifically in high-resolution captures, have noticed that the fingerprints on the shield are not identical. There are 4 distinct fingerprint patterns visible on the shield's surface, not 3. The Three Fingers have 3 fingers each, as the name would suggest. But if each of the 3 fingers left a print on the shield, and each finger has its own print, the total number of prints should be the number of the fingers times the number of fingers per hand, not simply 3. The fact that there are 4 distinct patterns doesn't obviously correspond to any simple accounting. One possible reading is that the 4th fingerprint is older. The 3 fingers predate the current age, and their lore suggests they were part of a larger structure, possibly including or originating from a 4th entity. The Crucible, the primordial state of life, is sometimes described in ways that suggest it had more aspects than the current world retains. If the 3 fingers were once part of a larger configuration, the 4th print might be the mark of an aspect that no longer exists in the current world. This is deep speculation. The 4th print could simply be an artifact of how the texture was painted, an extra mark that doesn't mean anything. But the specificity of the item's lore and the care that went into the Three Fingers story makes it hard to dismiss completely. The sealed grafting room in Stormvale Castle. There's a room that most players pass through quickly because it's primarily a corridor to the next area. But the walls of this room, if examined, have a feature that doesn't appear elsewhere in the castle. The walls are covered in what appear to be sealed doors, dozens of them, bricked up and mortared over, but visible in the stonework as outlines. These sealed doors lead nowhere accessible. The exterior geometry of the castle doesn't include the spaces they would open onto. They were sealed before the game shipped, and their destinations were either never built or were removed at some point in development. What's notable about the sealed doors is their size. They're human scale, some of them, but others are large enough to suggest the passage of something bigger. And the spacing between them suggests they were once regularly used, part of a functional layout rather than decorative. The grafting theme of Stormveil, the way Godric's influence has modified every living thing in the castle, including the architecture in some metaphorical sense, raises the question of what these sealed rooms might have contained. Godric's most extreme subjects are the grafted scions, assembled from multiple bodies. The creation of those subjects requires space, materials, labour, if there were rooms in the castle dedicated to this work, rooms that were sealed because Godric wanted to contain or conceal what happened there. The bricked-up doors would be. The alternative is that these are simply unused rooms from an earlier iteration of Stormveil's layout, blocked off when the castle's dungeon design was finalised. Both explanations are plausible. The lore-adjacent one is more interesting. The Nokstella water anomaly Nokstella, Eternal City, is the companion city to Nokron below it, and it shares the celestial sky feature that makes Nokron visual. Nokstella is further down, darker, and its architecture has a different quality, older perhaps, or from a different phase of the Eternal City's history. In Nokstella, in the area near the large Nokstella waterfall basin site of Grace, there's a section of flowing water that behaves differently from the rest of the water. Most of the water in Nokstella flows in predictable directions consistent with the dungeon's geometry. This section flows against the local gradient. Not dramatically, not in a way that's immediately obvious, but measurably. The water moves in the direction that water in that geometry should not be. This is almost certainly a river spline error, where the water flow direction was set manually and the manual setting conflicts with the terrain geometry. It's a common issue in games with water simulation. But in a city described as eternal, a city that was built by and for a civilization whose relationship to time and change was fundamentally different from the surface worlds. Water that flows against gravity is either a technical error or a feature. The Eternal City lore suggests its builders understood reality differently, that they had access to knowledge about the fundamental order of things that is no longer available to anyone in the surface world. Water flowing uphill in Nokstella might be a design detail that was added to establish that the city's physical rules are different, that the eternal nature of the place includes a suspension of some natural laws. Or it might be a river spline pointing the wrong way. In the context of a city called Eternal, the option that the water is supposed to flow that way seems worth considering. The Malenia room flowers the arena, where you fight Malenia, the great rot-filled flower garden, is one of the game's most visually distinctive boss rooms. The scarlet rot flowers, the bodies of the fallen clean rot knights, the tree of putrefaction at the centre, all of this creates a setting that communicates everything you need to know about who Malenia is and what she has done. But there's a specific type of flower in the room that doesn't correspond to the scarlet rot aesthetic. In the far corners of the arena, away from the main flower clusters, there are smaller flowers with a different coloration. They're not the characteristic red-orange of the rot, they're a pale gold, closer to the Erdtree's colour than to the rots. These flowers haven't been specifically identified in the game's item descriptions, and they're not prominent enough in the arena to be significant to most players. But they exist, and they're different, and they're there. The lore context is that Malenia is Miquella's sister, and Miquella's influence is associated with a different kind of bloom, the Halictree's growth, the healing influence of his unalloyed gold. If there are traces of Miquella's influence even in the place where Malenia's rot has been most fully expressed, it suggests either that Miquella had presence here at some point, or that even Melinia's rot cannot fully erase the influence of the sibling she fights to protect. The pale gold flowers in Melinia's arena might be the last physical traces of what Miquella meant to build before everything went wrong. The Lendel throne asymmetry, the Elden throne in Lendel, is one of the game's central landmarks, a seat of power that has been occupied by successive Elden Lords and that sits at the centre of the Golden Order's political and spiritual structure. Its design is grand, detailed, and consistent with the overall aesthetic of Lendel. But if you look at the throne carefully, it's asymmetrical. Not slightly. The left side of the throne has different decorative elements from the right side. The armrests are different. The symbolic carvings on either side don't match. The left side has Erdtree imagery. The right side has different imagery, older, less clearly associated with the current Golden Order iconography. This asymmetry in a throne of such importance is unusual. Thrones are almost universally symmetrical in their design because symmetry communicates balance and authority. Deliberate asymmetry in a throne communicates something else. The Elden Ring's own design, the ring that is the game's central artifact, is described as the accumulation of runes that define the order of the world. The two sides of that ring could correspond to the two sides of the throne, one side representing the current order's vision for the world, one side representing an older vision, or an alternative, or the half of the ring that was shattered. If the throne was built to hold two visions simultaneously, two possible orders, and the shattering broke the ring, but not the throne, then the asymmetry is the physical expression of a fundamental division in the world's design. What the Elden Lord is supposed to rule over isn't a unified order. It was always two things, held together by the ring, and now the ring is broken. The throne still sits there, asymmetrical, waiting for someone who can hold both sides. The Altus Plateau, wind direction, the Altus Plateau, is reached either through the Grand Lift of Dectus or through the ruin-strewn precipice, and it marks a distinct shift in the game's tone, moving from the more natural and ruined Limgrave and Liurnia into something more overtly golden and managed. The outer approaches to Lendel and the Erdtree's immediate domain. In the Altus Plateau, the wind consistently blows in one direction. This is normal for an open-world area. Most areas have a prevailing wind effect for atmospheric reasons. The Altus wind blows toward the Erdtree. What isn't normal is what happens to the wind in the areas closest to the Erdtree's base, the areas at the very edge of Lendel. The wind changes direction in those areas. It blows away from the Erdtree. The prevailing wind across the entire plateau moves toward the Erdtree, and then, at its closest approach, reverses. This creates a subtle area of calm just outside Lendel, where the two wind directions meet and cancel each other. Players who have noticed this describe it as feeling artificially still. The lore interpretation that fits here involves the Erdtree's relationship to the world around it. If the Erdtree draws something toward itself from the wider world, something that the wind direction represents, there might also be an outward emanation from the Erdtree itself that creates the reversal near its base. The Erdtree takes and gives simultaneously, and the boundary between those two flows would be where they cancel each other, in the zone of artificial calm just outside the city built in its shadow. Whether this is intentional environmental design or a wind system artifact is unclear, but the pattern is consistent and it sits in the right place for the lore to explain it. The Fia questline Phantom NPC Fia, the Deathbed Companion, has one of the game's most complex questlines, involving the accumulation of Deathroot, the sleeping of champions, and ultimately the attempt to establish a new order of death in the Deeproot depths. Her story connects to Godwyn and to the broader issue of what death means in the Lands Between's current state. There's a documented anomaly in Fia's questline at a specific point, specifically after the questline reaches its conclusion in the Deeproot depths and before the final resolution. In some cases, players have reported seeing Fia in two locations simultaneously. The round table hold still has her in her usual position even after she should have moved to the Deeproot depths, and the Deeproot depths has her in her questline appropriate location. The duplicate is not interactive. It can be approached but not spoken to, and it doesn't respond. It simply stands there in Fia's usual position, holding its arms open in her characteristic gesture. This is almost certainly a scripting error, where the game fails to properly despawn Fia's round table instance when she transitions to the Deeproot instance. A state flag isn't clearing correctly, and the old version persists while the new one activates. But the image of Fia standing in the round table with her arms open, silent, while her actual self is deep underground, attempting to restore something to death that should have died long ago, is genuinely affecting. The round table hold version, the one with no voice and no purpose, looks like exactly what the round table hold is in the late game. An echo of something that has moved on, a memory of function that no longer applies, preserved in the space because the space doesn't know what else to do. The scripting error accidentally creates the perfect visual for what the round table hold has become. The imp message throughout the catacombs of the lands between. There are small stone imp statues that guard the chests containing the most valuable items in those dungeons. These imps are triggered by the presence of a player and spring to life to attack. They're unpleasant but manageable. In one specific catacomb, the Impaler's Catacombs in the Weeping Peninsula, there's an imp that doesn't attack. It's in the standard position, in the standard pose, but when the player approaches the trigger radius that would normally activate it, it doesn't move. The activation animation begins. The imp's stone texture cracks, and then it stops. It sits there, half activated, not attacking, and not returning to its statue state. This is almost certainly a collision issue where the imp's pathing is blocked, causing its attack routine to fail and leaving it in a liminal state between dormant and active. But a half-awakened imp in the Impaler's Catacombs, the dungeon named for whoever impaled the bodies on the stakes throughout the dungeon, that sits motionless and stares, is a different experience than a broken enemy behaviour. In context, in a dungeon that is explicitly about suffering and punishment, an entity that woke up and then couldn't go forward looks like something that has lost the ability or desire to do what it was made to do. It's a broken game object. It also looks like something that changed its mind. The Altus Tunnel Acoustic Chamber. The Altus Tunnel is a mining dungeon in the Altus Plateau, notable for the presence of the Stone Digger Troll boss, and for the generally oppressive atmosphere of an underground worksite. Its audio design uses a lot of reverb and echo to sell the sense of being in a stone tunnel system. But in one room in the Altus Tunnel, specifically a dead-end room that branches off the main path and contains nothing of particular value, the acoustic properties are different from every other room in the dungeon. While the rest of the tunnel uses the reverb-heavy audio treatment appropriate for stone corridors, this room has almost no reverb. The audio is flat, close, as if you're in a very small space despite the room's visible dimensions. Players who have tested this have confirmed that the audio anomaly is reproducible and consistent with a room that has different acoustic parameters from its surroundings. In audio design terms, this usually means the room has a different reverb bus assignment. It was given the wrong audio zone settings, or its audio zone was set to a different profile than the rest of the tunnel. It's a technical error, but a room in an underground tunnel that sounds differently from all the surrounding rooms, a room that sounds like it's acoustically separated, would in the real world be a room that is physically isolated from its surroundings by its material or construction. A lead-lined room. A rubber-coated room. A room built to contain sound. If someone in the Altus Tunnel built a room to contain sound, the question is what the sound was that needed containing. Mining tunnels aren't usually built with acoustic isolation, unless there's something very loud or very secret happening in them. The room is a dead end with no particular contents of note. But its walls apparently, don't let sound out the way the rest of the tunnel does. The Rani gesture lore fragment there's a gesture in the game called Listen, which you acquire through Rani's questline. It's a straightforward item pickup. But the description of the gesture, or more accurately, the description of where and when Rani is doing this gesture, when you first see her perform it, connects to something that the game doesn't fully explain. Rani performs this gesture, or something similar to it, at the beginning of her questline. She's listening to something. The game doesn't tell you what. Players who have tested the sound environment during Rani's introductory scene have noted that there is an audio event present during that scene that doesn't appear at any other time in Rani's tower. It's a very faint sound, described as something between wind and music, that occurs only during the moments when Rani appears to be listening. What Rani is listening to is connected to her lore position in a significant way. Rani serves a different power than the Greater Will. Her questline is an attempt to establish a new age under a different cosmic authority, specifically the moon, and the power she refers to as the Dark Moon. If Rani is listening to that power communicating with her, and if the game's audio represents that communication, as the faint sound players have noted, then the listen gesture isn't just a trinket from her questline. It's a documentation of the moment when a god spoke to its chosen servant. The faint audio is there. What it means requires the context of Rani's entire questline and the broader cosmology of the game. But the moment of listening, in a tower in the middle of a frozen lake, listening to something only she can fully hear, is one of the game's most carefully constructed pieces of atmospheric storytelling, and the audio team apparently put actual content in that moment, rather than just leaving it silent. The Caelid Celia floating structure Celia, town of sorcery in Caelid, is one of the more visually interesting small areas in the game. It's a sorcerer's town that has been frozen in place by a barrier that prevented its residents from leaving during Caelid's infection by the Scarlet Rot. The residents are still there, zombified or dead, but standing, preserved in the moment of their town's end. There's a structure visible above Celia that most players never look up to see. At the top of one of the taller towers, visible only from specific angles, there's a platform or balcony that shouldn't be there based on the tower's geometry. The tower's interior, accessible through normal gameplay, doesn't have stairs or a ladder that leads to this height. The platform is accessible only through very specific, out-of-bounds methods. If you reach it, it's empty. No items, no enemies. Just a small stone platform that looks like it was designed to be stood on, to look out from over the town of Celia. The lore of Celia includes a sorcerer, Millicent's questline brings you to Celia, and the investigation of the town's ceiling involves understanding who created the barrier and why. The town's sealer is eventually identified, but the identity and motivation are left somewhat ambiguous in terms of whether the ceiling was meant to preserve or contain. A high platform in Celia, one accessible only with significant effort, that overlooks the town, would be the platform from which someone watched what was happening, from above and apart. Whether they sealed the town to protect its residents from fleeing into Caelid's rot, or to prevent the rot from spreading through the fleeing residents, the platform would look the same. You'd need to be up there to understand which it was. The platform is empty. The watcher, whoever it was, isn't there anymore. Before I continue, I want to highlight something that connects a lot of what we've been going through. There's a pattern across these anomalies, accidental or otherwise, where the game seems to preserve evidence of what it was during development, alongside what it became. The hidden rooms, the incorrect animations, the wrong textures showing up in the wrong places, all of these create a game with layers. A game where the history of its own creation is visible in certain places if you look hard enough. From Software's games have always been about archaeology in some sense. The act of playing them is the act of uncovering history, piecing together what happened from fragments left behind. The development archaeology visible in these anomalies is in a way another layer of that archaeology. You're not just uncovering the history of the lands between, you're uncovering the history of the game itself. let's continue. The Mog Cocoon pre-activation audio in Mogwyn Palace. In the chamber where Mequella's cocoon is visible, there's a sound that players have reported before the Mog boss fight. When you're in the approach to the boss area, before the fog gate, there's a brief stretch of corridor where the ambient audio changes. The standard audio of Mogwyn is oppressive and blood-drenched, appropriate for a palace literally running with sacrificial blood. But in that corridor, some players have reported hearing a sound that is entirely out of place in Mogwyn's audio landscape. A soft sound, high-pitched, described as either a hum or a very faint voice. Given the context, this is almost certainly bleed from Mequella's presence in the cocoon. Mequella is in there, being cultivated by Mohg, his divinity being slowly extracted or amplified for Mohg's purposes. If Mequella is alive in the cocoon, and the lore suggests he is in some form, and if he's aware, then the sound could be Mequella. Not calling for help. Not communicating in any meaningful sense. Just present. The visual presentation of the cocoon, with its golden warmth against the blood-soaked architecture of Mogwyn, creates the most effective horror image in the game through pure contrast. Something nurturing and protected in a place dedicated to consumption and violence. If the audio confirms that the nurturing thing is aware, is still in there, the horror is complete. The soft sound in the corridor is either environmental audio, a bleed from an adjacent sound zone, or it's the sound of a god who can't wake up. The Liurnia Academy Skydome seam, when you're inside Raya Lucaria Academy and look up, you can see the sky through the open courtyard areas. This sky looks correct from most angles, consistent with whatever the current time and weather are in Liurnia. But there's a seam visible in the sky dome when viewed from a specific vantage point inside the academy, specifically from the room that overlooks the large rotating water wheel mechanism. From this vantage, at a specific camera angle, the sky dome shows a visible edge where two different sky sections join. On one side of this seam, the sky looks like the standard Liurnia sky. On the other side, for a narrow strip near the seam, the sky looks slightly different. The colours are off, shifted slightly toward a cooler tone, and there are star positions visible in the strip that don't match the standard Liurnia night sky. This is almost certainly a sky dome tile boundary, a place where two sky texture tiles meet and their seam is visible due to the specific camera angle. It's a common rendering artifact in games that use tiled sky systems, but the strip of different sky visible in the seam, with its different star positions, raises the same question as the mountaintop star anomaly. What sky is that? If it's not the Liurnia sky, and it's not Farah Mazula's sky, what is the sky of the lands between supposed to look like? And why is a piece of something else visible through the crack? The Academy's study of the moon and the cosmological structures above the world makes it thematically appropriate for the sky to be wrong there. The Academy is a place that has spent its history looking up and asking questions about what's above. If the sky above the Academy isn't quite the same as the sky everywhere else, the question of why is exactly the kind of question the Academy was built to investigate. The Smouldering Church campfire, Glitch the Smouldering Church, is a small area at the border between Limgrave and Caelid, near the Shack of the Rotting, and it serves primarily as the location of a merchant and an early invasion trigger. It's not a narratively significant location in the way that the major legacy dungeons are. But there's a campfire at the Smouldering Church that has been documented doing something unusual. In some sessions, the campfire at the church has been observed burning in multiple colours, not the standard orange-yellow of a normal fire. The fire cycles through colours, briefly showing blue, then white, then returning to orange. Blue fire and white fire appear elsewhere in Elden Ring, associated with specific magical traditions. Blue with carrion sorcery, and white with the crucible, and certain boss-adjacent effects. A campfire at a minor roadside church showing those colours has no obvious explanation in terms of the game's design intent for that location. The smouldering church's name and its location at the border of Caelid connects it to the broader atmosphere of that region. But the coloured fire in the campfire isn't a major lore detail. It's a particle system or fire simulation acting in an unexpected way, almost certainly. The more interesting version of this is that the smouldering church is one of the game's more liminal spaces. It sits between two very different regions. It's occupied by both merchants and corpses. It has the quality of a way station for people moving between different parts of the world. Fire that shows multiple colours might, in the Lands Between's magical ecology, be fire that has been contaminated or enriched by being in a threshold space. The church's fire has touched the influences of both Limgrave and Caelid, both the relatively healthy land to the west and the rotted nightmare to the east. The coloured fire might be what fire looks like when it doesn't know which world it belongs to. The Four Belfries memory Bleed the Four Belfries are one of the more explicitly anomalous locations in the game by design. They're towers containing preserved portals to other places and times, accessible with imbued sword keys, and offering brief glimpses into locations you might not have visited yet, or that connect to major story beats. The three accessible portals take you to crumbling Farum Azula, the Chapel of Anticipation, and the interior of the Erd Tree. These are significant locations with significant lore connections. The fourth belfry, the one without a portal, has a small chest containing an imbued sword key, suggesting a placeholder for a fourth destination that either wasn't implemented or was removed. What's less documented is the audio behaviour of the belfries at night. Players who have stayed in the belfry area through the game's night cycle have reported that the inactive portals, the ones without imbued sword keys inserted, produce sounds that bleed through from wherever they're connected to. This makes sense in design terms. Portals that are tuned to a destination but not actively open might still transmit ambient sound from that destination, a low-level connection that the physical portal maintains even when the pathway isn't traversable. This is a detail that the game probably didn't intend to have players notice. The sounds described for each portal, the Farum Azula portal bleeding storm sounds, consistent with that area's permanent tempest, the chapel portal bleeding the sound of wind and possibly rain, consistent with the chapel's exposed exterior. Both of these are contextually appropriate. The Erd Tree portal is described as bleeding a sound that players can't easily categorise. Some describe it as a deep hum. Some describe it as voices, but voices speaking very slowly, so slowly that the words are lost in the low pitch. Some describe it as nothing, a pointed absence of sound rather than ambient audio. The interior of the Erd Tree, based on the brief glimpse the portal provides, is a place that exists outside the normal rules of the world. If sound transmitting through a portal to the Erd Tree's interior doesn't arrive in a form that makes intuitive sense, that's consistent with a place where the rules of time and causality are different. The pointed absence of sound is, in some ways, the most unsettling option. The Erd Tree is the centre of everything in the Lands Between. If you put your ear to the portal that connects to it and hear nothing, either the portal isn't working, or the Erd Tree's interior has nothing in it that makes a sound, or whatever is in there is listening so quietly it hasn't needed to make noise in a very long time. The Malekith Leap Origin Point Malekith, the Black Blade, is one of the game's most spectacular bosses, famous for his aggression and for the dramatic second phase transition. His lore is extensive and connects directly to the game's central themes of death, order, and the Elden Ring itself. There's a documented anomaly in Malekith's jump attacks. In certain phases of the fight, Malekith performs leap attacks from one platform to another, crossing the arena in ways that emphasize his predatory quality. These leaps have specific trajectories and landing points carefully placed for gameplay purposes. But in a small number of documented cases, Malekith's leap does not originate from where he was standing. His model performs the leap animation from a position slightly offset from his actual position, creating a visual ghost image of the attack's beginning that doesn't match where he was. This is an animation interpolation error, the kind of thing that happens when an AI transition between movement states doesn't complete cleanly before the next state begins. In lore terms, Malekith is described as an entity that exists in a relationship with time and death that is different from other beings. The Black Blade, the weapon he carries, contains the rune of destined death, the power that the Golden Order sealed away to prevent natural death from occurring in the lands between. Malekith is the keeper of that seal, the guardian of the suppressed power of death, an entity whose nature is defined by its relationship to the rune of death. A rune whose suppression has bent the world's relationship to time and fate, having a visual anomaly where its animations appear to originate from the wrong point in space, looks, in this context, like the game is showing you something true about Malekith. He exists in a slightly different relationship to physical space than everything else in the arena. The animation error looks like what it would look like if Malekith's body and his presence in the world weren't perfectly aligned. The Fell God's Fire, Colour the Flame of the Fell God, is an incantation in Elden Ring associated with the fire giants, and with whatever deity the giants worshipped, the entity described throughout the game as the Fell God, a being associated with fire and with a power that predates the Erdtree's order. The flame this incantation produces is orange-red, similar in colour to the fire produced by the fire giant boss and the broader fire-associated imagery of the mountaintops. But players who have used this incantation in very specific lighting conditions, specifically in areas where the Erdtree's golden light is most concentrated, have noted that the colour of the Fell God's flame changes. It doesn't become golden, it becomes a darker colour, a deep red that is distinct from both the standard orange-red of the flame and the gold of the Erdtree. In normal and in standard lighting, the flame looks the way fire looks. In the Erdtree's light, it looks like blood. The lore of the Fell God and the Erdtree is one of conflict. The giants' worship of the Fell God was the source of the original fire they used to threaten the Erdtree, the fire that Marika eventually directed Godfrey to extinguish, the fire that threatened the Erdtree, and the fire that the Erdtree is now burning in, are connected through a lineage of violence. If the Fell God's fire reveals its true colour in the presence of the entity it originally threatened, the colour it shows is the colour of the wound. This is probably a lighting interaction effect, a situation where the Erdtree's golden ambient light shifts the perceived colour of the fire through additive blending. But the image, the Fell God's fire going dark red in the shadow of the Erdtree, describes something the lore has been gesturing toward throughout the game. The perfumer's grotto scent this is an unusual anomaly because it's tactile and experiential rather than visual or audio, and reports of it are more subjective than the visual glitches. But it's been reported consistently enough to note. The perfumer enemies in Elden Ring are associated with the Erdtree and with a tradition of alchemical enhancement using incense and fragrance. Their bottles and sprays are described in item descriptions as preparations made from specific combinations of natural materials, and the perfumers themselves were artisans of a high order in the lens between social structure. In the perfumer's grotto dungeon, in the areas where multiple perfumer enemies are active simultaneously, players have reported a sensation of actually smelling something. This is obviously impossible through game hardware for most players. The reports don't claim the players actually smelled anything through their screens. What they describe is more like synesthesia, a visual experience that creates the impression of smell, where the particle effects of the perfumer attacks and the visual presentation of the grotto create a sensation of scent that isn't literally present. The visual design of the perfumer attacks, the coloured mists and sprays, combined with the cramped and specific environment of the grotto, apparently creates a strong enough impression in some players that they report being able to almost smell it. This isn't a game anomaly in any technical sense. It's an achievement of art direction that crosses sensory categories. But it's worth including here because it represents an anomalous experience that players have consistently reported in this specific location, and which connects to what the perfumers are described as having achieved in the lore. Their craft was so refined that it could alter how reality presented itself to the senses. If the game's rendering of their environment creates even a fraction of that effect in the real-world player, then the art team has done something extraordinary. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. The Erd tree swaying there's a very subtle animation on the Erd tree that most players either don't notice or attribute to wind effects in the game's environment. The Erd tree, despite its enormous size, moves. The upper branches and canopy have a slow, continuous movement that functions as an idle animation for the tree. The anomaly is in the pattern of movement. Trees sway in wind according to the wind's direction and speed, and the movement pattern is typically influenced by the surrounding environment. The Erd tree's movement doesn't correspond to the wind in the areas surrounding it. Players who have observed this carefully have noted that the Erd tree's movement pattern is consistent, slow, and regular, more like breathing than like swaying in wind. The rhythm of it, measured by players who have used timing tools, is approximately one full cycle every 12 seconds. This is almost certainly just an animation loop, a procedural or hand-animated movement cycle applied to the Erd tree as an environmental detail. 12 seconds is a fairly standard loop length for large environmental animations. But the breathing interpretation is hard to dislodge once you see it. The Erd tree is alive in the lore, not just alive in the way a tree is alive, but alive in a way that connects to divine consciousness, to the greater will's presence in the world. If it breathes, if the slow, regular movement of its branches is an expression of an organic process rather than just environmental animation, then the Erd tree is more present than it appears. A god that breathes is a god that can be made to stop breathing. The Crucible Knight off-screen sound the Crucible Knights are among the most well-designed regular enemies in the game, and they're significant in lore terms as survivors from the age before the current order. Warriors from the time of the Crucible, wearing armour that contains aspects of the Crucible's primordial life energy. Fighting one is described by many players as one of the game's more satisfying combat encounters. But there's a documented audio anomaly in the Crucible Knight encounter in the Stormhill Evergale specifically. In this fight, when the Crucible Knight is off-screen, meaning when the camera is oriented away from the enemy, players have reported hearing audio that doesn't correspond to the Crucible Knight's standard moveset. The Crucible Knight in this Evergale is a standard type, using the axe and shield loadout. Its standard audio includes attack sounds, movement sounds, and idle vocalizations, all consistent with a heavy armoured fighter.